At the division meeting of my late wife's assets, my son-in-law thought I didn't see when he put a strange substance in my glass of water. When he got distracted, I switched the glasses. Everyone was in shock with what happened next. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. The lawyer's office felt smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the grief still weighing on my chest, or maybe it was the way my daughter Susan kept glancing at her husband David with that look, you know the one, like they were sharing a secret I wasn't supposed to know about. 6 months, that's how long it had been since Margaret passed. 6 months of rattling around our house alone, learning how to make coffee for one person, how to sleep in a bed that felt too big. The cancer took her slowly, then all at once, and I still caught myself looking for her in the kitchen every morning. "Mr. Brennan, shall we begin?" The lawyer, a thin man named Peterson, shuffled through papers that would determine how Margaret's life would be divided up, reduced to numbers and property lines. I nodded, adjusting my position in the uncomfortable chair. Across from me, Susan sat rigid, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. David had his arm around her shoulders, but something about his posture seemed wrong. Too casual for a funeral home meeting, too confident. "As you know, Mrs. Brennan's estate is substantial," Peterson continued. "The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, we're looking at approximately $14 million in total assets." David's eyes lit up for just a second before he caught himself. Susan squeezed his hand. I pretended not to notice, but a cold feeling settled in my stomach. Margaret had always been the peacekeeper between Susan and me. Without her there to smooth things over, the distance between my daughter and me had grown into a canyon. "Before we proceed with the reading," Peterson said, "I'll need to verify some documentation. This will take about 15 minutes. Please feel free to use the conference room or step out for coffee." Susan stood immediately. "I need some air," she announced, not looking at me. David followed her like a shadow, whispering something in her ear that made her nod. I stayed seated, staring at the family photo Peterson had placed on the table. Margaret, Susan, David, and me at last Christmas. We all looked happy. Sometimes photographs lie. The conference room had a small kitchenette with bottled water and coffee. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the long mahogany table, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming. Margaret had always handled the finances. She'd been the organized one, the planner. I was just the retired engineer who fixed things around the house and made her laugh. That's when Susan and David came back in. They sat across from me, and I could feel the tension radiating from them like heat from a furnace. David kept checking his phone, then looking at his watch. Susan picked at her fingernails, something she'd done since childhood, when she was nervous. "Dad," she said finally, her voice softer than it had been in months. "I know this is hard. Losing Mom, I mean. But we need to talk about practical things now." I sipped my water and waited. In my 64 years, I'd learned that when someone starts a conversation with, "We need to talk about practical things," they're usually about to ask you for something you don't want to give. "The house is too big for you now," David said, leaning forward. His voice had that smooth quality he used when he was trying to sell something. He worked in real estate, and everything sounded like a pitch with him. "Susan and I have been thinking maybe it's time to consider your options." "My options?" I asked. "Assisted living," Susan said quickly. "Not because you need it now, but as a precaution. You're 64, Dad. Mom did everything for you, the cooking, the bills, the appointments. How are you managing on your own?" The question stung because it had some truth to it. I had been struggling with the daily routines Margaret had handled so effortlessly, but there was something in the way David was nodding along that made my skin crawl. "I'm managing fine," I said, though we all knew it wasn't entirely true. David stood up and walked to the kitchenette. "Let me get you some fresh water, Harold. You look a little pale." I watched him in my peripheral vision as he moved around behind me. Something about his movements seemed deliberate, calculated. He opened and closed cabinets, ran the tap. But when he set the new glass down in front of me, I caught a glimpse of something in his expression. Satisfaction, maybe, or anticipation. The water looked the same as before, clear, normal. But David sat back down with a different energy now, like a man who'd just accomplished something important. "The thing is, Dad," Susan continued, "David found some really nice places. Not nursing homes, independent living communities. You'd have your own apartment, but there'd be people around, activities. It might be good for you." I picked up the new glass of water David had brought me, but something made me hesitate. Call it instinct, call it paranoia. But in that moment, I remembered something Margaret had said about David during one of her bad days near the end. "He watches you differently when he thinks you're not looking," she'd whispered. "Like he's calculating something." At the time, I'd thought it was the pain medication talking. Now, watching David watch me drink, I wondered if Margaret had seen something I'd missed. "You should drink something," David said. "You look dehydrated." The concern in his voice sounded rehearsed. I lifted the glass toward my lips, then stopped. David's phone buzzed on the table, and when he reached for it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. He had a timer running, counting down from what looked like 5 minutes. A timer. In that split second, everything clicked into place. The way they'd both left when Peterson stepped out. David's trip to the kitchenette, the timer on his phone, the look of anticipation in his eyes. My hand moved faster than my brain could process what I was doing. When David glanced down at his phone again, I switched our glasses. His had been sitting there untouched, while mine was the one he'd specially prepared. "To Margaret," I said, raising the glass that had been his. David looked up sharply, his face going white. "Wait, Harold, maybe we should—" But I'd already taken a sip. Not much, just enough to make it look like I was drinking. David's timer showed 3 minutes and counting. "Your turn," I said, gesturing to the glass in front of him, the one that had originally been mine. Something flickered across David's face. Fear, maybe, or panic. But Susan was watching and he couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. He picked up the glass with hands that trembled slightly. "To Margaret," he echoed, and drank. The timer on his phone hit 0, just as Peterson returned to the room. "Sorry for the delay," the lawyer said. "Are we ready to proceed?" But David wasn't listening. His face had gone gray and sweat was beading on his forehead. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "David?" Susan's voice was sharp with concern. "Are you okay?" He tried to speak, but only a choking sound came out. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed forward onto the table. Susan screamed. Peterson lunged for his phone to call 911. And I sat there, my heart pounding, staring at my son-in-law's unconscious form and realizing that my own daughter's husband had just tried to kill me. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. As they worked on David, loading him onto a stretcher, Susan turned to me with tears streaming down her face. "What happened?" she demanded. "What did you do to him?" I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised, loved, protected, and saw a stranger, because in her eyes I could see she already believed I was the one to blame. The ambulance doors slammed shut, taking David away. Susan climbed in beside him without looking back, and I was left standing in the parking lot, wondering how everything in my life had just changed in the space of 5 minutes. Peterson appeared beside me, his face pale. "Mr. Brennan, I think we should postpone the reading until we understand what just happened." I nodded, but my mind was racing. The timer on David's phone, the way he'd prepared my water, the look of panic when I'd switched the glasses. My son-in-law had tried to poison me in a lawyer's office, and somehow I'd turned the tables without even meaning to. But as I drove home to my empty house, one question burned in my mind. If David was willing to kill me for Margaret's money, what else was he capable of? The hospital smelled like disinfectant and desperation. I'd spent too many hours in places like this during Margaret's final months, and walking through those automatic doors brought back memories I wasn't ready to face. But I had to know what the doctors had found in David's blood. Susan was in the waiting room, her face puffy from crying. She looked up when she saw me, and for a moment I thought I saw relief in her eyes. Then the walls went back up. "The doctors say he was poisoned," she said without preamble. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "They found something called ricin in his system." Ricin? Even I knew what that was. You don't watch the news for 64 years without learning about the poisons people use to kill each other. It comes from castor beans, and it's deadly in small amounts. How is he? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Stable. They got to him fast enough. Susan's eyes were red-rimmed but hard. The police want to talk to you. Of course they did. I was the only other person in that room, the only one who could have put poison in David's drink, except that wasn't what happened, and I had no idea how to explain the truth without sounding like a crazy old man. Detective Morrison was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much of what people do to each other. He found me in the hospital cafeteria, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like hot water. Mr. Brennan, I'm Detective Morrison. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened today. I nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. I figured you would. He pulled out a small notebook and pen. Old school. I liked that about him. Can you walk me through the events at the lawyer's office? So I did. I told him about the meeting, about Susan and David stepping out, about David bringing me fresh water. I even told him about the timer on David's phone, though I could see skepticism creep into Morrison's expression when I mentioned it. You're saying your son-in-law poisoned your water, but somehow he ended up drinking it instead? That's exactly what I'm saying. Morrison studied me for a long moment. Mr. Brennan, with respect, that sounds like something out of a movie. Why would David want to poison you? I'd been asking myself the same question for the past 4 hours. $14 million, I said finally. That's what Margaret's estate is worth. And if I was dead, Susan would inherit everything. But Susan's your daughter? Wouldn't she inherit anyway? Not necessarily. Margaret and I never discussed the details of her will. I don't know what she decided. It was the truth, though I was starting to have suspicions. Morrison made notes, his pen scratching across the paper. We'll need to examine your son-in-law's phone, see if there really was a timer running. We'll also need to test any remaining water from the lawyer's office. You won't find any poison in the water I was supposed to drink, I said. Because I didn't drink it. David did. The detective closed his notebook. Stay in town, Mr. Brennan. We may have more questions. After Morrison left, I sat alone in the cafeteria, thinking about the past 2 years. David had married Susan 3 years ago, and at first I'd been happy for her. She was 35 and had been single for a while after a messy divorce. David seemed charming, successful, attentive. But looking back now, I could see the pattern I'd missed before. The way he'd gradually inserted himself into every family decision. How he'd encouraged Susan to see my opinions as old-fashioned, out of touch. The subtle ways he'd driven a wedge between my daughter and me. During Margaret's illness, David had been helpful, but controlling. He'd insisted on managing Margaret's care schedule, coordinating with doctors, handling insurance paperwork. At the time, I'd been grateful. I was drowning in grief and didn't know how to navigate the medical system. Now, I wondered what else he'd been managing. My phone buzzed. A text from Susan. Need to talk. Meet me in the parking garage, level 3. I found her standing next to her car, smoking a cigarette. I hadn't seen her smoke since college. Her hands were shaking as she brought it to her lips. The police think you tried to kill David, she said without looking at me. Is that what you think? She took a long drag, exhaled slowly. I don't know what to think anymore. For the first time since Margaret's death, my daughter looked lost, vulnerable, like the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared her. Susan, I need you to listen to me. Really listen. David brought me a glass of water today, and there was something wrong about the whole situation. He had a timer on his phone. When I switched our glasses, he panicked. You switched the glasses? Her voice was barely a whisper. Yes, and that's why he's in the hospital instead of me. Susan dropped her cigarette, grinding it under her heel. That's impossible. David wouldn't. He loves me. He loves our family. Does he? Or does he love what our family can give him? The question hung in the air between us. I could see Susan wrestling with it, trying to reconcile the man she'd married with the possibility that he'd tried to murder her father. During Mom's last month, I said carefully, she said something to me. She was worried about David, said he asked too many questions about her will, about the insurance policies. I thought it was just the medication making her paranoid. Susan's face went pale. She never told me that. There's a lot she didn't tell you. She didn't want you to worry. My daughter leaned against her car, looking suddenly exhausted. If what you're saying is true, then everything I thought I knew about my marriage is a lie. I hope I'm wrong, I said, though I knew I wasn't. But we need to find out for sure. That evening, I drove home to the house Margaret and I had shared for 37 years. Every room held memories, but tonight they felt different, tainted. I kept thinking about David moving through these spaces, calculating their value, planning my death. I made myself a sandwich I didn't want to eat and sat at the kitchen table where Margaret used to pay bills. Her desk was still organized exactly as she'd left it, with neat piles of papers and her favorite pen lying beside an appointment calendar she'd never finish using. That's when I remembered the safe. Margaret had installed a small fireproof safe in our bedroom closet after her diagnosis. She'd said it was for important documents, but she'd never told me the combination. When the time comes, you'll figure it out, she'd said with that mysterious smile she got when she was planning something. I'd forgotten about it completely until now. The safe was hidden behind her winter coats exactly where she'd shown me. It was one of those electronic models with a digital keypad. I tried our anniversary date first, then her birthday, then mine. Nothing. Then I remembered something else Margaret used to say. The most important things aren't always the most obvious ones. I typed in Susan's birthday. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside were documents I expected: birth certificates, insurance policies, the deed to the house. But there was also a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Margaret's careful handwriting. And underneath that, a copy of her will I'd never seen before. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. "My dearest Harold," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've finally found this safe. I pray you found it before you needed what's inside, but knowing you, you probably waited until something went wrong to look for it. Even in death, Margaret knew me too well. I need you to know that I changed my will 3 months before I died. I left everything to you, not to Susan. I know this will hurt you to read, but I had to protect our daughter from herself. David is not the man we thought he was." The letter went on to detail things I'd never noticed. Phone calls Margaret had overheard where David talked about my value to the family, questions he'd asked about my health, my life expectancy, the way he'd started isolating Susan from her friends, making her financially dependent on him. "I hired a private investigator," the letter continued. "David has gambling debts we don't know about, serious ones. He married Susan for access to our money, and I believe he would do anything to get it, even hurt you." My vision blurred as I read the last paragraph. "I'm sorry to burden you with this knowledge, my love, but if something happens to you, something that doesn't seem like an accident, look at David first. Trust your instincts, and remember that I love you more than life itself. Take care of our daughter, even if she can't see that she needs protecting." I set the letter down with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Margaret had known. She'd seen what I'd missed, and she'd tried to protect us both the only way she could. The will was clear. Everything, the house, the investments, the life insurance, came to me. Susan would inherit only if I died before her, and David would inherit nothing at all unless something happened to both of us. 14 million reasons for David to want me dead. I thought about Susan in that hospital waiting room, torn between her husband and her father. She had no idea that her marriage was built on lies, that the man she loved had tried to murder me for money he would never actually get. Tomorrow, I would have to tell her the truth. I would have to show her Margaret's letter and watch her world fall apart. But tonight, sitting alone in the house that was now mine by default, I finally understood what my wife had been trying to tell me in those final weeks. Some threats come from the people closest to you, and sometimes the only way to survive is to see them coming before they strike. Detective Morrison called me at 7 in the morning, 3 days after David's poisoning. I'd been awake for hours anyway, sitting at Margaret's desk with her letter spread out in front of me, like evidence in a trial I never wanted to be part of. "We need to talk, Mr. Brennan. Can you come down to the station?" The police station smelled like burnt coffee and stress sweat. Morrison led me to a small interview room with fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly yellow. He set a manila folder on the metal table between us and opened it with the careful precision of a man who'd done this too many times. "We found some interesting things on your son-in-law's phone," he said, pulling out printed screenshots. "You were right about the timer. It was set for 5 minutes, started right around the time you said he brought you that water." I stared at the image of David's phone screen. Seeing it in black and white made the whole thing feel more real somehow, more deliberate. But that's not all we found. Morrison flipped to another page. "David's been researching ricin for the past 2 months. How to make it, how much is lethal, how long it takes to work. His browser history reads like a poisoner's manual." The room felt suddenly cold. 2 months? Maybe longer. We're still going through his computer at home. Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Brennan, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Your son-in-law has been planning to kill you for a while. I thought about Margaret's letter, about the private investigator she'd hired. Detective, there's something I need to show you." I pulled out the copy of Margaret's letter I'd brought with me. Morrison read it twice, his expression growing grimmer with each word. "Your wife hired a private investigator?" "Apparently. I never knew about it until I found this letter." I handed him the business card that had been tucked inside the envelope. She mentioned gambling debts. Morrison copied down the investigator's information. "We'll follow up on this. In the meantime, I need to ask you something difficult. How well do you know your daughter's financial situation?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "We've been looking into David's debts. He owes money to some very serious people, the kind who don't accept late payments." Morrison pulled out another document. "But here's the thing. Your daughter has been making payments on his behalf, large ones. The numbers on the bank statements made my stomach lurch. Susan had withdrawn over $200,000 from her savings account in the past year. All of it went to something called DC Consulting, which Morrison explained was a front for a gambling operation." "She knows about his debts?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "It's hard to say. The payments could have been made without her knowledge if David had access to her accounts, but—" Morrison hesitated. "There's something else. Your daughter took out a life insurance policy on you 6 months ago, $2 million, with her as the beneficiary." The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "That's impossible. I would have had to sign papers, take a medical exam." "You did. The insurance company has your signature on file, along with medical records from your doctor's office." Morrison showed me copies of documents I'd never seen before. My signature was on every page, but I had no memory of signing them. I would remember something like that. "Think back 6 months ago, Mr. Brennan. Were you dealing with anything stressful? Maybe not paying close attention to what you were signing?" 6 months ago. Margaret had been in her final decline, requiring round-the-clock care. David had been so helpful, bringing me papers to sign for medical authorizations, insurance claims, prescription refills. I'd signed dozens of documents without reading them carefully, trusting that David was looking out for Margaret's best interests. "He mixed them in with other paperwork," I said, the realization hitting me like a sledgehammer. Medical forms, insurance claims. I was so focused on Margaret, I just signed whatever he put in front of me. Morrison nodded grimly. "It's a common scam. Predators target people who are grieving, distracted, vulnerable. They slip fraudulent documents in with legitimate ones." I stared at my own signature on the life insurance application, trying to remember the moment I'd written it. But those final weeks with Margaret were a blur of medication schedules, doctor visits, and sleepless nights. David could have convinced me to sign my own death warrant, and I probably would have done it without question. "There's more," Morrison continued. "We talked to your wife's private investigator. David's debts aren't just from gambling. He's been running investment scams, taking money from elderly clients and using it to cover his losses. The people he owes money to aren't just bookies. They're the kind who make problems disappear permanently." The full scope of David's plan was becoming clear now. Kill me, collect the life insurance money, inherit Margaret's estate through Susan, and use it all to pay off debts that could get him killed if he didn't settle them soon. "What about Susan?" I asked. "Is she involved in the investment scams?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "We don't think so. All the evidence points to David operating alone, using your daughter's name and social security number without her knowledge. She's a victim too, Mr. Brennan. But even as he said it, I could see doubt in his eyes. And I understood why. Susan had access to her own bank accounts. She had to know about the large withdrawals, the insurance policy, something. I need to talk to her, I said. I wouldn't recommend that right now. She's hired a lawyer, and she's not speaking to anyone about the case. Of course she had. My daughter was protecting the man who'd tried to murder her father. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from everything Morrison had told me. The house felt different now, knowing that David had walked through these rooms planning my death. Every surface he'd touched, every conversation we'd had, every family dinner where he'd smiled and called me Dad, all of it had been part of an elaborate lie. That afternoon, I called the private investigator Margaret had hired. Janet Reeves had a voice like gravel and the no-nonsense attitude of someone who'd seen every kind of human ugliness imaginable. Your wife was smart to hire me when she did, Janet said when I explained who I was. David Bradley is a piece of work. Real name's David Kowalski, by the way. He's changed his identity twice in the past 10 years. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. Janet turned out to be a small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair. She carried a thick file folder that she set on the table between us like a weapon. Your wife suspected something was wrong when David started asking detailed questions about your health insurance, your medical history, your exercise habits. Normal son-in-law curiosity, except he was taking notes. Janet opened the folder and showed me photographs I'd never seen before. David meeting with men in expensive suits outside what looked like a casino. David at a computer in an internet cafe, his face tense with concentration. David talking on a cell phone while parked outside our house, watching the windows. He's been surveilling your family for over a year, Janet explained, learning your routines, your medical appointments, your financial habits. He even followed you to the grocery store multiple times, timing how long you spent in different sections. The photographs made my skin crawl. This man had been studying me like a lab rat, looking for the perfect opportunity to kill me. The gambling debts are real, Janet continued, but they're only part of the story. David's been running a Ponzi scheme targeting elderly investors. He takes their retirement savings, promises huge returns, then uses the money to pay off earlier investors and to cover his gambling losses. The whole thing's about to collapse. She showed me a list of names, people in their 70s and 80s who'd trusted David with their life savings. Margaret's name was on the list, along with a figure that made my heart stop. $300,000. He stole from Margaret? Not exactly. She gave him the money willingly, believing it was an investment opportunity. But she started getting suspicious when he couldn't provide proper documentation. That's when she called me. Although I stared at the paperwork, trying to process what I was seeing. Margaret had given David $300,000 of our retirement savings, and he'd stolen it. No wonder she'd changed her will. There's something else you need to know, Janet said, her voice gentle but firm. Your daughter might be more involved than the police think. We found evidence that she helped David recruit some of his elderly investors, people from her social circles, friends of yours and Margaret's. The coffee in my mouth turned bitter. Susan would never... I'm sorry, Mr. Brennan, but your daughter introduced David to at least 6 of his victims. She vouched for him, told them he was family, that they could trust him with their money. The folder contained copies of emails Susan had sent, glowing recommendations for David's investment services. She'd even hosted dinner parties where David pitched his scheme to unsuspecting retirees, using our home as a backdrop to establish credibility. She had to know, Janet said quietly. Maybe not the full extent of it, but she had to know something wasn't right. I left the coffee shop feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Everything I thought I knew about my daughter was crumbling. She wasn't just David's victim, she was his accomplice. Maybe not in the murder plot, but in the financial crimes that made murder necessary. That evening, I sat in Margaret's chair in our living room, surrounded by evidence of my family's betrayal. The private investigator's files, the police reports, Margaret's final letter to me. All of it painted the same picture. The people I'd loved and trusted most had been planning to destroy me. My phone rang. Susan's number flashed on the screen. Dad? Her voice sounded small, frightened. I need to see you. Can I come over? Of course. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And Dad, don't call the police, please. I just need to talk to you. After she hung up, I sat staring at the phone in my hand. My daughter was coming home, maybe for the last time. In 20 minutes, I would have to look her in the eye and ask her how long she'd known that her husband was a killer. And I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. Susan arrived exactly 20 minutes later, just like she always had since childhood. Even in crisis, my daughter was punctual. She knocked softly instead of using her key, and when I opened the door, I saw she'd been crying. Her makeup was smeared, her hair unwashed, and she clutched a tissue box like a lifeline. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, as if I were a stranger who might turn her away. We sat in the living room where she'd grown up, where Margaret had taught her to braid friendship bracelets, and where I'd helped her with calculus homework. The same room where David had probably planned my murder while I watched television in my recliner. "The police think David tried to kill you," Susan said, without preamble. She couldn't look at me when she said it. "What do you think?" She was quiet for a long time, twisting the tissue in her hands until it fell apart. "I think my whole life has been a lie. I waited. In 64 years, I'd learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the silences between words. David's been acting strange for months," she continued. "Secretive phone calls, mysterious meetings, coming home late with cash he couldn't explain. When I asked about it, he said he was working on a big real estate deal, something that would set us up for life. Did you believe him?" Susan's laugh was bitter, broken. "I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to so badly. We were living beyond our means, Dad. The house, the cars, the vacations. We couldn't afford any of it on David's real estate income. But he kept saying the big deal was coming, that everything would work out." She looked around the room, her eyes landing on family photos that included David, happy moments that now felt contaminated. "Then the police told me about the gambling, the debts, the insurance policy he took out on you." Her voice cracked. "They showed me bank statements, Dad. Hundreds of thousands of dollars withdrawn from my accounts to pay off his debts. Money I didn't even know was missing." "How could you not know?" The question came out harsher than I intended, but I needed to understand. Susan flinched, as if I'd slapped her. "He handled all our finances, said it was one less thing for me to worry about. I was so busy with work, with taking care of Mom during her illness, that I just let him manage everything. I trusted him completely." I studied my daughter's face, looking for signs of deception, but all I saw was a broken woman who'd realized that her marriage was built on quicksand. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The police asked me about people David and I knew, elderly people with money. They think he was running some kind of investment scam." My heart sank. "Susan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you introduce David to any potential investors?" The way her face crumpled told me everything I needed to know. "I thought I was helping friends," she sobbed. "David said he had this amazing investment opportunity, something that could help retirees get better returns on their savings. He asked me to mention it to people we knew, people who might be interested." "Who did you talk to?" Susan buried her face in her hands. "Mrs. Henderson from down the street, the Johnsons from church, your old colleague, Frank Miller, and his wife, maybe 6 or 8 people total. I told them David was family, that they could trust him." Each name hit me like a physical blow. These were people Margaret and I had known for decades, friends who'd trusted our judgment, our family connections. "Susan, how much money did they give him?" "I don't know. David said it wasn't my concern, that he'd handle all the business details. But Mrs. Henderson called me last week, asking when she could expect her first dividend payment. She said she'd invested her entire pension with David." The room felt like it was spinning. Mrs. Henderson was 82 years old, living alone on Social Security and her late husband's pension. If David had stolen that money, she'd have nothing left. "Did you know the investments were fake?" Susan looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "No, I swear to you, Dad, I had no idea. I thought David was actually helping these people. When Mrs. Henderson called, I asked David about it, and he said there'd been some paperwork delays, but everything would be sorted out soon." I wanted to believe her. Every instinct as a father made me want to protect my daughter, to accept her version of events. But the evidence was overwhelming, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The private investigator your mother hired found emails you sent, I said gently. Recommendations for David's services. You hosted dinner parties where he pitched his investments to our friends. Susan's face went white. Mom hired a private investigator? I showed her Margaret's letter, watching as she read about her mother's suspicions, her fears, her desperate attempt to protect us both. By the time Susan finished reading, she was shaking. She knew, Susan whispered. Mom knew what David was doing, and she tried to warn us. She changed her will, Susan. She left everything to me instead of you. My daughter's reaction surprised me. Instead of anger or hurt, she just nodded slowly. Good. If she'd left it to me, David would have gotten his hands on it eventually. Mom was protecting you the only way she could. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Susan really had been an unwitting victim. Maybe there was still something to salvage from the wreckage of our family. But then she said something that shattered that hope completely. Dad, I need to ask you something, and please don't hate me for it. Susan's voice was steady now, resigned. The police want me to testify against David. They want me to tell a jury about the dinner parties, the investor introductions, everything. But if I do that, I'll be admitting that I helped him steal from people we've known for years. Susan, these people trusted you. They trusted our family. Don't you think they deserve justice? Of course they do. But Dad, if I testify, I could go to prison too. The prosecutor said I might face charges as an accessory to fraud, even if I didn't know what David was really doing. I could lose everything, my job, my reputation, my freedom. I stared at my daughter, understanding finally dawning. What are you asking me to do? David's lawyer thinks if we present a united front, if we both say this was all a misunderstanding, that maybe the charges could be reduced. David made mistakes, but he never meant to hurt anyone, and he certainly never tried to kill you. Susan, he had ricin in his pocket. He set a timer on his phone. He researched poisons for months. His lawyer says all of that could be explained. The ricin could have been planted. The internet searches could have been for a novel he was writing. The timer could have been for something else entirely. I felt like I was talking to a stranger. This woman who looked like my daughter, who sounded like my daughter, was asking me to lie for the man who'd tried to murder me. You want me to say David didn't try to kill me? I want you to say you're not sure what happened. That maybe you misunderstood the situation. That's not really lying, is it? Can you honestly say you're 100% certain about everything that happened that day? The manipulation was subtle, but unmistakable. Susan was using the same techniques David had probably used on her, creating doubt, offering rationalizations, making the victim question their own perceptions. Susan, David tried to poison me. If I hadn't switched those glasses by accident, I'd be dead right now. But you're not dead. You're fine. And David almost died instead. Hasn't he suffered enough? I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and realized that I'd already lost her. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the little girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. She wasn't even the confused victim I'd hoped she might be. She was David's accomplice, willing to sacrifice her own father to save her husband. I can't do what you're asking, I said finally. Susan's expression hardened. Then you're choosing to destroy what's left of our family. No, Susan, David already did that. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse and car keys. Fine, but don't expect me to choose you over my husband. David made mistakes, but at least he never abandoned me the way you did. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. What are you talking about? You think I don't remember how it was after Mom got sick? You disappeared, Dad. Emotionally, physically, every way that mattered. David was the one who held me together. David was the one who listened to me cry, who took care of the practical things, who made sure I ate and slept and functioned. I was grieving too, Susan. I was trying to take care of your mother and deal with my own pain. And what about taking care of me? I lost my mother, but you were so wrapped up in your own grief that you forgot I needed a father too. The words stung because they held a grain of truth. I had withdrawn after Margaret's death. I had struggled to be the father Susan needed while dealing with my own overwhelming loss. David saw that, Susan continued. He stepped in when you stepped out. He became the family I needed when you couldn't be bothered. So you're going to protect the man who stole from our friends and tried to kill me? I'm going to protect my husband, the only person who's been there for me consistently. Susan paused at the door, her hand on the knob. I won't testify against David, and if you try to force me to, you'll lose me forever. I think I already have. Susan's face crumpled for a moment, and I saw a flash of the daughter I remembered. But then the mask slipped back into place. Goodbye, Dad. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that sounded like finality. I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by photos of a family that no longer existed, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Outside, I heard Susan's car start and drive away. She was going home to David, choosing the man who'd manipulated and used her over the father who'd loved her since the day she was born. Margaret had been right to change her will. She'd seen what I'd been too blind to notice. Our daughter was already lost to us, captured by a predator who'd used her love against her. Now I truly understood what it meant to be alone. 6 months. That's how long it took for the trial to begin and end. 6 months of watching my daughter sit in the front row behind David's defense table, her hand clasped in his mother's, her eyes never meeting mine. 6 months of testimony from elderly victims who'd trusted our family name, only to lose their life savings to David's elaborate lies. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they came back, the foreman read the verdict with the kind of gravity reserved for the worst kinds of human betrayal, guilty on all counts: fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The judge sentenced David to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. Susan sobbed when they led him away in shackles. I felt nothing but a hollow relief that justice had been served, even if it came too late to save my relationship with my daughter. The prosecutor had offered Susan immunity in exchange for her testimony, but she'd refused. In the end, her silence spoke louder than any words could have. She'd chosen David over truth, over justice, over family. The district attorney decided not to pursue charges against her, citing lack of evidence that she'd known about David's criminal intent. But we all knew the real reason. A jury would have seen her as another victim, manipulated by a master predator. After the trial, Susan moved to Phoenix to be closer to the federal prison where David was serving his sentence. She found work as a medical receptionist and rented a small apartment near the facility. According to mutual friends, she visited him every week, faithfully maintaining her belief that he was innocent, that somehow the justice system had failed them both. I tried calling her once, 3 months after the sentencing. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice flat and guarded. "Hello, Dad." "Susan, I was hoping we could talk, maybe have dinner, try to work through this." "There's nothing to work through. You chose to destroy David, and I choose to stand by my husband. Some decisions can't be undone." "He tried to kill me, Susan. He stole from people we've known for decades." "That's what you believe. I believe something different, and nothing you say is going to change my mind." The line went dead. I never called again. But life, I discovered, doesn't stop just because your family falls apart. The first few months after the trial were the darkest I'd ever experienced. Darker even than the weeks after Margaret's death, because grief, at least, had dignity. This was just emptiness. I rattled around the house that felt too big, too full of memories that had been poisoned by David's betrayal. Every room held echoes of family dinners where he'd smiled and called me Dad while planning my murder. Every photo on the mantel reminded me of how completely I'd been fooled. That's when Elena Martinez entered my life. She was one of the nurses who'd cared for Margaret during her final weeks at home. 58 years old with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that had seen enough suffering to understand it without judgment. During Margaret's illness, Elena had been professional but warm, efficient but compassionate. She'd made Margaret laugh even on the worst days, and she'd taught me how to manage medications and monitor symptoms when the regular staff wasn't there. I hadn't seen her since Margaret's funeral, where she'd offered quiet condolences before disappearing into the crowd of mourners. But now, standing in the produce section of the grocery store 6 months after David's conviction, I found myself face to face with her again. "Harold?" She looked surprised but pleased. "How are you holding up?" It was a simple question, but something about the way she asked it, with genuine concern rather than polite obligation, made me pause. How was I holding up? Terribly. Alone. Lost. "Some days are better than others," I said finally. Elena nodded, understanding immediately that this wasn't about Margaret anymore. I heard about the trial. I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult. We stood there among the apples and oranges, two people who'd been through different kinds of loss, recognizing something in each other that didn't need explanation. Would you like to get coffee sometime? I asked, surprising myself. I could use a friend. Elena smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt something besides emptiness. I'd like that. We met the following Tuesday at a small cafe downtown. Elena had worked as a hospice nurse for 20 years, she told me, helping families navigate the hardest transitions of their lives. She'd seen every kind of grief, every variety of family dysfunction, every way that people could hurt each other or heal together. The hardest cases, she said over her second cup of coffee, are the ones where family members turn against each other during a crisis. Death and money bring out the worst in people sometimes. I found myself telling her about David, about Susan's choice to stand by him, about the loneliness that felt like a physical weight on my chest. Elena listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped me understand my own feelings better. Do you think you'll ever forgive her? She asked. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I understand why she made the choices she did. David manipulated her for years, isolated her from other relationships, made her dependent on him emotionally and financially. But understanding doesn't make the betrayal hurt less. Elena reached across the table and touched my hand gently. Healing doesn't require forgiveness, Harold. Sometimes it just requires acceptance. Over the following weeks, Elena and I began spending more time together. She introduced me to her world, the hospice where she worked, the families she helped, the quiet satisfaction of being present during life's most difficult moments. Through her eyes, I began to see purpose beyond my own pain. We need volunteers, she mentioned one afternoon, as we walked through the botanical gardens downtown. People who can just sit with patients and families, listen to their stories, help them feel less alone. The idea terrified and intrigued me in equal measure. I don't know anything about hospice care. You know about loss. You know about being abandoned by the people who should love you most. That's more qualification than most people have. I started volunteering 2 days a week, initially just reading to patients or helping with simple tasks. But gradually, I found myself drawn into deeper conversations with family members who were struggling with their own versions of what I'd experienced. Adult children fighting over inheritances, siblings who hadn't spoken in years, spouses who felt guilty for wanting the suffering to end. There was something healing about helping other people navigate their pain. It gave my own suffering context, purpose. I wasn't just a victim of David's manipulation anymore. I was someone who could offer guidance to others facing similar betrayals. Elena and I grew closer through this shared work. She never tried to replace Margaret in my heart, and I never asked her to. Instead, we built something new together, based on mutual respect and understanding rather than the passionate romance of younger years. I love you, I told her one evening as we sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I love you too, she replied simply, but we both know this isn't the same as what you had with Margaret, or what I had with my first husband. She was right. This was something different, quieter, more measured, built on the foundation of two people who had learned that love could coexist with loss, that happiness could grow in soil that had been scorched by betrayal. A year after David's conviction, Elena and I decided to marry. It was a small ceremony in the hospital chapel where she worked, attended by a handful of friends and colleagues. No family by mutual agreement. We'd both learned that families of choice could be stronger than families of blood. Susan found out about the wedding through mutual acquaintances. She sent a card, no message, just her signature, that arrived 3 days after the ceremony. I kept it for a week before throwing it away. Some gestures were too little and too late to carry meaning. Elena moved into the house I'd shared with Margaret, and together we made it into something new. We kept some of the old furniture and photos, but added new pieces that reflected our shared life. Margaret's sewing room became Elena's home office. The formal dining room where David had planned my murder became a casual breakfast nook where Elena and I read the morning paper together. Most importantly, we turned the guest bedroom into a respite space for families dealing with end-of-life care. When someone needed a place to stay while their loved one was in hospice, when out-of-town relatives needed somewhere to process their grief, they could come to us. The room that had once been decorated for a grandchild I'd never get to babysit became a sanctuary for other people's families. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked me one evening as we prepared the room for a family whose patriarch was dying of cancer. Not having a relationship with Susan? I considered the question carefully. I regret that it came to this. I regret that David was able to manipulate her so completely. But I don't regret choosing truth over family loyalty. Margaret raised me to believe that right and wrong matter more than blood relationships. Elena nodded, smoothing fresh sheets on the guest bed. My grandmother used to say that some people are put in our lives to teach us how to love, and others are put there to teach us how to let go. Looking back now, I could see that Susan had been both. She'd taught me the fierce, protective love of parenthood. But she'd also taught me that sometimes loving someone means accepting that they're lost to you, that they've chosen a path you can't follow. David's conviction had been front-page news in our local paper. The headline read, "Local real estate agent sentenced for elder fraud, attempted murder." Underneath was a photo of him being led away in handcuffs, and another of Susan covering her face as she left the courthouse. I'd kept a copy of that newspaper, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe as proof that justice had been served. Maybe as a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. Or maybe just as evidence that sometimes the good guys really do win, even when the victory comes at a terrible personal cost. The $14 million that David had tried so hard to steal was still mine, though it felt different now, heavier. I couldn't spend it without thinking about Mrs. Henderson, who'd lost her pension to David's lies, or Frank Miller, whose retirement savings had disappeared into David's gambling debts. So Elena and I decided to do something Margaret would have approved of. We established a foundation to help elderly victims of financial fraud, providing emergency assistance and legal support to people who'd been targeted by predators like David. It wasn't enough to undo the damage he'd caused, but it was something. As I drifted off to sleep beside Elena each night, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Susan in this very house over a year ago. She'd accused me of abandoning her, of choosing grief over fatherhood. Maybe she'd been right about that. Maybe I had failed her in some fundamental way that made David's manipulation possible. But I'd learned something important in the months since then. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. And you can't love someone enough to overcome their willingness to betray you. Susan had made her choice. Now I was learning to live with mine. 3 years after David's conviction, I received a call that changed everything one last time. Elena was at the hospital working her evening shift when my phone rang with an unknown number from Phoenix. I almost didn't answer. After everything with David and Susan, I'd grown suspicious of unexpected calls. "Harold?" The voice was familiar but different, older, more fragile than I remembered. "Susan? Dad, I need to tell you something. David is dead." I sank into Margaret's old reading chair, the one Elena and I had kept when we redecorated. What happened? Prison fight. Another inmate stabbed him over some gambling debt from before his conviction. The warden said he died instantly. Susan's voice was eerily calm, like she was reporting the weather rather than her husband's violent death. I waited for her to break down, to sob, to demand comfort from the father she'd rejected 3 years earlier. Instead, there was just silence. "Susan, are you okay?" A bitter laugh came through the phone. "Am I okay? Dad, I've been visiting a federal prison every week for 3 years, believing in a man who tried to murder my father. I've been living in a studio apartment, working for minimum wage, and spending every spare dollar on his commissary account. Am I okay?" Something in her tone had shifted. The blind loyalty that had defined her voice for years was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like clarity. "I found something in David's cell when I went to collect his personal effects," she continued. "Letters. Dozens of them, addressed to other women. Women he'd been corresponding with, promising to marry them when he got out, telling them the same lies he told me, asking them for money for his appeals. But I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar mixture of anger and sadness. Even in prison, David had been running cons, manipulating vulnerable women who thought they were saving a wrongfully convicted man. There was one letter that hadn't been sent yet, Susan said, her voice growing stronger. It was addressed to me. In it, David admitted everything: the poison, the insurance fraud, the investment scams. He wrote about how easy it had been to manipulate me, how I'd been the perfect cover for his crimes because I was so trusting, so desperate to believe in him. Susan, he called me pathetic, Dad. Said I was useful because I was naive enough to believe anything he told me. He wrote about how he'd planned to divorce me the moment he got out of prison, take whatever money I'd managed to save, and disappear with one of his pen pals. The pain in her voice cut through 3 years of hurt and anger. This was my daughter, not David's accomplice, not his defender, but the broken woman who'd finally seen the truth about the man she'd sacrificed everything to protect. I'm sorry, Susan. I'm so sorry you had to find out that way. I've been such a fool. Now the tears came, deep sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief. I chose him over you. I defended him when I should have known better. I lost 3 years of my life and I lost my father, all for a man who saw me as nothing more than a useful idiot. We talked for 2 hours that night. Susan told me about the isolation of the past 3 years, how David's conviction had cost her most of her friends and professional connections. She'd been living like a ghost, working dead-end jobs and spending her weekends in a prison visiting room, clinging to a fantasy of a marriage that had never been real. I keep thinking about what Mom's letter said, Susan told me near the end of our conversation, about how she changed her will to protect me from myself. She saw what I couldn't see. She knew I was making a terrible mistake. Your mother loved you, Susan. She was trying to save you the only way she knew how. I want to come home, Dad, not to live. I know too much has happened for that, but I want to see you. I want to try to make things right between us. You're always welcome here, Susan. You're my daughter. That never changed, even when everything else did. She arrived the following weekend, driving the same car she'd had 3 years earlier, but looking like a completely different person. The confident, polished woman who'd chosen David over family was gone. In her place was someone who looked older, sadder, but somehow more real than she'd been in years. Elena greeted Susan with the grace I'd come to expect from her, offering coffee and kind words without pretending that the past 3 years hadn't happened. We sat in the living room where Susan had once demanded that I lie to protect David. But this time, the conversation was different. I owe you both an apology, Susan began, not just for choosing David, but for the way I treated you during Mom's illness and after her death. I was so wrapped up in my own grief that I couldn't see yours, Dad. And when David offered to take care of everything, to handle all the practical details, I let him, because it was easier than dealing with my own pain. I studied my daughter's face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize, but all I saw was genuine remorse, the kind that comes from finally understanding the weight of your mistakes. David knew exactly what he was doing, she continued. He isolated me from everyone who might have questioned his motives. He made me financially dependent on him, emotionally dependent on him. By the time you and the police presented evidence of his crimes, I was so deep in his web that I couldn't see the truth, even when it was right in front of me. Eleanor reached over and squeezed my hand. We'd talked about this moment many times over the past 3 years, wondering if Susan would ever break free from David's influence. Seeing it happen was both heartbreaking and hopeful. What are your plans now? Elena asked gently. I'm moving back to California, not here. I think Sacramento would be too hard for all of us, but I found a job in San Francisco, working for a nonprofit that helps families dealing with elder abuse. Ironic, I know, considering what I helped David do to people like Mrs. Henderson. The mention of Mrs. Henderson made my chest tighten. She'd died 6 months after David's conviction, having never recovered financially or emotionally from losing her life savings. At her funeral, her daughter had approached me to say that Mrs. Henderson never blamed me for David's crimes, but that she died still wondering how she could have been so foolish. "I know I can't undo the damage I helped cause," Susan said, reading my expression. "But maybe I can help other families avoid what happened to ours. Maybe that's how I make amends." We spent the rest of the weekend talking, really talking, for the first time since Margaret's death. Susan told me about the therapy she'd started after finding David's letters, about the slow process of untangling 3 years of manipulation and self-deception. I told her about my work with Elena at the hospice, about the foundation we'd established, about the strange peace I'd found in helping other people navigate their own family crises. "Are you happy, Dad?" Susan asked on Sunday evening, as she prepared to drive back to Phoenix to pack up her apartment. "I'm content," I said. "It's different than happiness, but maybe it's better, more sustainable." Susan hugged me goodbye, the first time she'd touched me in 3 years. "I love you, Dad. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I hope someday we can have a real relationship again." "We're having one now," I told her. "The past is the past, Susan. What matters is what we do moving forward." After she left, Elena and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, just as we had hundreds of times over the past 2 years. But something felt different now, lighter. "How do you feel about Susan coming back into your life?" Elena asked. "Cautiously optimistic," I said. "She seems different, more herself, if that makes sense, less like the person David molded her into. Recovery from that kind of manipulation takes time, but she's taking the right steps. Therapy, distance from the toxic relationship, meaningful work. Those are good signs." Elena was right, as she usually was about matters of the heart. Over the following months, Susan and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully. She moved to San Francisco as planned and threw herself into her work with elder abuse victims. We talked on the phone once a week and met for dinner once a month, always in neutral territory, always with Elena present. Trust, we both understood, would take time to rebuild. 6 months after David's death, Susan did something that surprised me. She returned to our hometown and visited the graves of the people David had victimized. Mrs. Henderson, Frank Miller, 3 others who'd died in the years since losing their savings to David's schemes. She left flowers and handwritten apologies, even though they'd never read them. "I needed to acknowledge what I helped him do to them," she explained when she told me about it. "Even if they can't forgive me, I needed to ask." A year later, Susan met someone new, a social worker named Marcus, who understood trauma and manipulation from his work with domestic violence survivors. She brought him to meet Elena and me, nervously introducing him as someone special rather than rushing into promises of forever. She'd learned to be more careful with her heart. As for David's $14 million dream, it remained mine to steward. Elena and I continued expanding our foundation, helping more families each year to recover from financial predators and navigate the legal system. We established a scholarship fund in Margaret's name for nursing students who wanted to work in hospice care. We even bought a small cabin by a lake where families dealing with end-of-life issues could retreat for free, away from the stress of hospitals and treatment centers. The house where David had planned my murder became a place of healing instead. The dining room where he'd set his timer was now where Elena and I held support group meetings for families dealing with elder abuse. The kitchen where he'd prepared my poisoned water was where we baked cookies for hospice patients and their loved ones. Margaret would have been proud, I thought. She'd seen the danger David posed and tried to protect us in the only way she could. Her final gift, changing her will, hiring the private investigator, leaving me the letter that revealed the truth, had saved my life and eventually saved Susan's soul. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't switched those glasses that day in the lawyer's office. David would have gotten away with murder, inherited $14 million through Susan, and probably moved on to his next victim. Susan would have spent the rest of her life married to a killer, never knowing the truth about the man she'd loved. But I had switched the glasses, driven by an instinct I still didn't fully understand. And that single moment of intuition had saved us both, even though it took 3 years for Susan to realize she needed saving. On quiet evenings, Elena and I would sit in Margaret's old reading chair together, me reading aloud while she worked on her knitting. We'd found a different kind of love than the passionate romance of younger years, but it was no less real for being built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than physical attraction and hormonal intensity. "Do you ever miss the excitement of your first marriage?" Elena asked me one evening. "I miss Margaret every day," I said honestly. "But I don't miss the drama, the uncertainty, the feeling that everything could fall apart at any moment. This is better, calmer, more honest." She smiled and kissed my forehead. "I love our boring life." And I did too. After years of betrayal and manipulation, of family members who saw me as an obstacle to their desires rather than a person deserving of love and respect, the quiet contentment Elena and I had built together felt like the greatest victory of all. David was dead. Susan was healing. Margaret's legacy lived on through our foundation and the families we helped. And I was finally truly free, not just from David's schemes, but from the burden of trying to maintain relationships with people who didn't value my existence. At 67 years old, I'd learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to show up for each other day after day with honesty and kindness and respect. Elena and I had that. The families we worked with in hospice had that. And slowly, carefully, Susan and I were building it too. The $14 million that David had killed for would never bring back the people he'd hurt, but it could help others avoid the same fate. And in the end, that felt like the kind of justice Margaret would have approved of. Not revenge, but redemption. Not punishment, but purpose. I was finally at peace.